The torn black garbage bag lying beside the alley dumpster wasn't like the others. Not just more trash left to rot behind the bakery. No, something inside it had moved, and that didn't smell like moldy bread or meat scraps. No, this smelled like life, fragile and fading. Toby, a sandy-coated stray with weather-worn eyes and a limp in his back leg, edged closer, ears perked, breath steady, cautious but drawn to the bag with something deeper than instinct, and when he nosed the torn plastic open with a soft grunt, what he found inside jolted through every nerve in his body. It was a baby, no more than a few days old, skin pale, lips tinged blue, barely breathing, bundled in nothing but a thin blue blanket already soaked from dew and trash. Toby stepped back, looked around the empty alley like someone might be watching, but there was no one. Just the hum of a flickering street lamp and the smell of yeast and rain from the night before. And without fully understanding what he was doing, Toby took the edge of the bag in his jaws gently, carefully, and began limping toward the only place he'd ever known that stayed lit through the dark hours. The big white building on Elm Street, with the glass doors and the buzz of rushing people. Mercer. General Hospital? Toby had lived on the streets for nearly a decade, surviving off kindness when it came, and trash bins when it didn't, kicked aside more times than he could count, hissed at, shooed, ignored. And yet, here he was, dragging a bag that held a human life, muscles trembling with each step. But he didn't stop, didn't second guess, didn't even bark, just pressed on as the sun began to rise behind the smokestacks across the river. By the time Toby reached the hospital entrance, his legs were shaking and the bag had snagged on a storm grate twice. But he'd made it. Glass doors swished open and chaos erupted inside. Paramedics unloading a patient from an ambulance. Nurses, in scrubs rushing past, security already waving and shouting as they spotted the stray charging in. "Hey, get that dog out of here!" But Toby didn't stop, didn't drop the bag, just kept moving, pushing past legs and carts and stairs, heading deeper into the hospital until he reached a staff lounge near the rear where 3 nurses sat with coffee cups and weary eyes. 2 jumped up, ready to shoo him off. But the third, a young woman with tired freckles and a blue pen tucked behind her ear, froze when she saw his eyes. Eyes not wild or afraid, but focused, desperate even. "Wait!" she whispered, and Toby stopped, gently lowering the torn bag onto the linoleum floor before stepping back, tail stiff, head low. The nurse, Aaron Walker, dropped to her knees and opened the plastic, then gasped, scrambling backward and yelling for help. "It's a baby! It's a baby!" Within seconds, a crash team descended, scooping up the infant, checking vitals, rushing him to neonatal ICU, while Aaron remained kneeling, eyes locked on the dog who'd brought the baby in from the alley. Toby didn't run, didn't bark. He just stood there, watching, chest heaving, until Aaron reached out her hand, and for the first time in nearly 10 years, someone touched him gently, scratching behind his ear, and he leaned into it with something like relief. Over the next few hours, Toby remained curled in a corner of the hospital lounge, while doctors worked furiously to stabilize the infant. Hypothermia, early signs of malnutrition, but a heartbeat was there. A flicker of life, just enough. And, by mid-morning, the news had broken. "Stray dog saves abandoned newborn," headlines said. Cameras showed up. Nurses cried on live feeds, and the story spread like wildfire. But behind the scenes, Aaron was already making a decision. She wasn't letting Toby go back to the streets, not after what he'd done, not after the way he looked at her like she'd already become home. She took him in that night, laid a blanket for him by the heater, and watched as he finally curled up and slept like something that knew safety for the first time in forever. In the days that followed, both Toby and the baby, now named Benjamin, became something of local legends, though neither understood the cameras or the reporters or the flashing lights. All Toby knew was that Aaron's apartment smelled warm and safe, and every time she reached to pet him or whisper his name, something softened in his chest that he didn't have a name for. 3 weeks later, Aaron brought Toby to the neonatal wing where Benjamin now slept peacefully beneath soft lights and beeping monitors, his cheeks rounder, his breathing strong. Toby stood beside the glass, tail wagging slightly, ears lifted, and when Benjamin stirred in his sleep, Aaron swore. She saw his lips curl into a tiny smile. Toby visited every day after that, sometimes curling on the floor beside Aaron's chair as she read aloud to the baby, sometimes just watching through the glass, always quiet, always present. Months passed, and Benjamin grew stronger, and by the time he came home wrapped in a soft new blue blanket, Toby was already waiting at the door, tail thumping against the floor like a heartbeat. The three of them, Aaron, Benjamin, and Toby, settled into a rhythm that felt like healing. Long walks, quiet afternoons, the occasional treat under the table, and nights where Benjamin fell asleep with his tiny hand resting on Toby's back. A story like theirs doesn't come often, but when it does, it reminds people that even broken things can be whole again. Even strays can be heroes, and even the smallest kindness, a decision to trust, to act, can save a life. So if you've made it this far, do me a favor. Like, comment, and subscribe. Not just to the story, but to the idea that compassion is still worth believing in. Because Toby wasn't trained, wasn't owned, wasn't anything but a forgotten mutt with a limp and a name no one ever said out loud, until the day he did the impossible and saved a life wrapped in garbage and left to die. And now, he had a home, a boy, and a purpose. And if that isn't the heart of what it means to be a hero, I don't know what is. In the days that followed the baby's release from the hospital, life at Aaron Walker's house began to shift into something softer, slower, and more sacred than anything she had ever known. The kind of fragile normal that crept into place. When grief was paused and trauma tucked just out of reach, as if everyone was holding their breath but smiling anyway. Toby adjusted the fastest, strangely enough, considering he had spent most of his life fending off larger dogs and digging through trash for half-eaten donuts. Yet here he was, moving through the hallways like a seasoned guardian, every pad of his paw placed with silent intention. Always. Keeping just close enough to the baby's bassinet to monitor breathing, but far enough to not wake him with the tap of a nail. And Aaron noticed how his ears would twitch at the slightest whimper, how his head would lift whenever the wind shifted through the window, how he never seemed to truly sleep unless the baby did too. And in those precious moments, the home felt held together by invisible threads, as if the three of them had formed a bond no one else could ever touch or explain. Aaron, who had once come home to an apartment lit only by the blue light of her overworked laptop, now found herself humming lullabies as she sterilized bottles and folded impossibly small onesies, her heart bruised with how fast she had grown attached, not just to the baby, but to the strange, noble animal that had brought him into her life. There were nights she sat on the couch long after the baby had fallen asleep in her arms, staring at Toby stretched out on the rug, his chest rising and falling slowly, one paw occasionally twitching in a dream she wished she could see, and she'd whisper to him as if he could understand every word. "You found him, Toby. You saved him. And you saved me too." And maybe he couldn't understand the words, but he always blinked slowly and wagged his tail once in reply, a gesture so deliberate and calm that it made her chest ache in the best way. People in town talked, of course, because small towns always do, and some said Aaron had lost her mind, taking in a stray dog and an abandoned child like she was running some halfway home for the forgotten. But others, especially the older nurses and hospital staff, spoke of her with a kind of hushed reverence, as if she had become a myth in the making, the kind-hearted nurse who heard a silent cry no one else could, the woman who opened her door not just to life, but to redemption. And even local news stations continued to run the story weeks later, footage of the grainy hospital security tapes showing Toby limping through the automatic doors with the bag still clutched in his jaw. And every time Aaron saw that clip, she would press a palm to her mouth to hold back tears, because even though she lived it, it still felt unreal, like something out of a book that had slipped off the page and landed in her lap. But the part no one saw, the part that never made it into the stories or interviews, was what happened when the cameras were gone and the baby was asleep and the house was quiet. When Aaron would sit in the nursery and let the silence wrap around her like a blanket of truth, and she'd wonder what kind of mother could throw a newborn away like garbage. What kind of world made a dog more nurturing than a human? And she'd feel guilt pressing against her ribs like a vice. Not because she had taken the baby in, but because a small, ugly part of her was glad someone else had given him up so she could love him. And she hated herself for thinking that, but it was the truth. And Toby always seemed to know when she was spiraling, always nudged her hand or laid his heavy head in her lap until the tears stopped, like he was saying, "It's okay, you don't have to carry this alone, not anymore." And the baby, who Aaron had started calling Ben after her grandfather, responded to Toby like he was more than just a dog, his tiny fists reaching for Toby's fur even before he could crawl, his giggles erupting whenever Toby licked his toes or let out a low, rumbling sigh that sounded like home itself. And the months passed like that, quietly, rhythmically, full of new beginnings and slow healing, and by the time Ben turned 6 months old, the three of them were inseparable, a unit of misfits stitched together by chance and choice. But just when Aaron began to believe the worst was behind them, that the rest of their life might unfold with peace and purpose, the first knock came, a heavy, deliberate thud on the door just after sunset, and Toby was the first to react, growling low from the kitchen as he stood and moved toward the door, with his body tense, his ears back, and Aaron, cradling Ben in her arms, felt her stomach twist, not in fear but recognition, as if something from a nightmare had stepped into waking life. She opened the door slowly, cautiously, and found a man in a suit too clean for their street and shoes that had never stepped in mud, holding a folder in one hand and a badge in the other, and he introduced himself as Agent Lowell from Child Protective Services, saying there had been a report, anonymous of course, that a child was living in the home without proper documentation, and Aaron felt the blood drain from her face, her fingers gripping Ben tighter, while Toby stepped between her and the man without being told, his teeth barely visible, but his message clear: don't try anything. And Agent Lowell, to his credit, took a small step back and nodded. "I understand this may come as a shock, but if we can just talk inside." And Aaron, against every instinct in her body, let him in, because if she refused, they might come back with force, and Ben was too small to understand what was at stake, too young to know that his very existence now depended on forms and signatures, and things that didn't matter when he was blue-lipped and dying in a trash bag. And the conversation was civil but tense, full of polite phrases that masked sharp blades. Words like custody, biological parentage, unauthorized, guardianship, and state care. And Aaron answered every question with calm determination, her voice never trembling even as her knuckles turned white. And Toby stayed beside her the entire time, a silent sentinel, his eyes locked on the stranger. And before leaving, Agent Lowell said, "This isn't over, Ms. Walker. You've done a beautiful thing here, but we have protocols for a reason." And Aaron simply nodded, then closed the door behind him and slid down the wall to the floor, holding Ben close as Toby laid beside them, pressing his weight against her as if to say, "I'm still here." And for the next few weeks, Aaron lived in a state of hypervigilance. Every car that slowed outside made her heart race. Every unknown number on her phone made her hands sweat, but she also started taking steps, reaching out to lawyers, gathering documents, trying to thread a legal needle so thin most wouldn't even attempt it. But she had to, because she couldn't lose the child who had become her son, or the dog who had become her soul. And as the case slowly unfolded in background meetings and court prep, something else began to stir. Something she hadn't noticed. Until it was almost too late. Toby was changing, not drastically, but enough to be seen, his limp worse than usual, his appetite smaller, his eyes more tired. And at first Aaron thought it was just age catching up to him, the years of surviving finally wearing him down. But one night, as he struggled to climb, onto the couch beside her, she reached out to help and felt it. An odd lump under his ribcage, hard and unmoving. And the panic that surged through her was immediate and blinding, because life had just started to make sense, just started to feel livable, and the idea of losing Toby now, when they had just become a family, was too cruel to consider. She rushed him to the vet the next morning, holding him close in the passenger seat of her old Corolla as Ben slept in the back. And the waiting room was too bright, too sterile. And when the vet, a kind older man named Dr. Halverson, came back with the test results, he didn't have to say anything. Aaron saw it in his face, the way his smile didn't reach his eyes, the way his shoulders drooped as he said, "It's cancer. Probably been there a while. Spread more than we hoped." And Aaron blinked, shook her head, whispered, No, he just saved a baby. He can't." And the vet said quietly, "Sometimes the ones who give the most don't stay the longest." And for the first time since this all began, Aaron let herself break, crying into Toby's fur as he simply rested his head on her lap, calm as ever, as if he was already preparing her for goodbye. But she wasn't ready, not yet. And so they started treatment, gentle and slow, not to cure but to buy time, to give them a few more sunsets, a few more walks, a few more mornings with Ben's laughter filling the house. And somehow, through all of it, Toby remained, steady, never once showing fear, only love, only presence, only that quiet, watchful grace that had defined him since day one. And one morning, as Aaron rocked Ben in the backyard under the fading gold of autumn leaves, Toby limped over and placed his head on her knee, his eyes closing slowly, his breath warm against her leg. And in that moment, surrounded by the hum of crickets and the scent of earth and rain, she knew, no matter how long they had, it would never be enough, but it would always be worth it. The first frost of winter settled over the little town like a whisper that carried warning in its chill, touching rooftops with delicate white fingers, frosting the edges of windows, and curling around doorways as if testing the locks that held back what people preferred to keep inside. And inside Aaron's house, everything felt suspended in a kind of fragile stillness, the air thicker, the silences longer, as if time itself were watching and waiting, unwilling to disturb what could be one of the last peaceful moments for a long while. Toby's treatments had slowed him, dulled his once watchful eyes, and though he still rose when Ben cried and followed Aaron from room to room, his steps were stiffer, each motion costing him more than it had before, and Aaron could feel her own heart fraying each time she caught him wincing as he settled onto his blanket, or when he paused halfway up the stairs, panting lightly, as if weighing whether the effort was worth the destination. She pretended for a while, for Ben's sake mostly, that everything was okay, that things were normal, decorating the house with gentle lights, and buying a tiny tree that Ben would stare at wide-eyed every time the coloured bulbs flickered on, and Toby would lie beneath it, head resting near the base like he was guarding it, or maybe guarding the magic it gave them, one that Aaron clung to like a lifeline because deep down she knew something was coming, something bigger than Toby's illness, something that had begun the moment Agent Lowell first knocked on their door. And sure enough, just a week before Christmas, she got the official letter, thick paper and heavy ink, and a tone that was meant to sound polite, but felt more like a knife, informing her that a court date had been scheduled, and that the state had located someone claiming biological ties to the child. And her fingers shook as she read it. Toby beside her on the couch, his head lifting slightly as if sensing the change in her heartbeat, and Ben asleep in the next room, oblivious to the storm about to bear down on his world. And Aaron sat there in the quiet, letter in hand, her mind racing with fears she couldn't even name. Because what if they were too late? What if love wasn't enough? What if a courtroom couldn't see what Toby had seen that day? That this child had been left for dead, and that Aaron, broken but brave, had rebuilt him piece by piece with lullabies and love and sleepless nights. The weeks leading up to the court date were a blur of paperwork and quiet desperation, of whispering reassurances to Ben and kissing his soft forehead while her own eyes carried the weight of looming loss. And Toby grew weaker still, but he never let her falter, never let her cry alone, always there with the press of his body against her leg, the slow wag of his tail, a steadying heartbeat in the middle of chaos. When the court day finally came, it was snowing, a soft, relentless fall that blanketed the streets and silenced the world in white, and Aaron dressed Ben in the little blue coat with the bear ears on the hood, kissed Toby goodbye, and promised him she'd be back before sunset, her voice cracking as she turned the key in the door and left behind, not just her home, but her safety net, because she knew once those courtroom doors opened, nothing was guaranteed. The building itself felt colder than the snow, all steel and silence and the echo of shoes against tile. And when they entered the courtroom, Aaron held Ben like a shield, like a prayer, sitting quietly as her lawyer whispered strategy and reassurances that sounded more like rehearsed lines than comfort. And across the room sat a woman Aaron had never seen before. Young, too young. Eyes haunted and distant, hands fidgeting in her lap. And Aaron knew before they even introduced her. This was Ben's birth mother. Her name was Lena, and when the judge asked her to speak, her voice trembled like wet leaves in the wind. And she told a story that made even Aaron's breath catch, about fear and running, about an abusive boyfriend who'd threatened to kill her and the baby, about how she thought dumping the child would somehow save him, how she hadn't stopped crying since, how she hadn't slept in months, how she didn't want to take the baby back but needed to know he was safe. And Aaron, who had come ready to fight, sat stunned, unable to hate the girl who had nearly destroyed the life she now treasured more than anything, because all she saw was another woman breaking in a different way. And when the judge called for a recess, Aaron stepped outside into the snow and found herself crying not out of fear, but out of the sheer weight of compassion she hadn't expected to carry. And when they returned to the courtroom, the decision was delayed, continued pending further evaluation, a phrase that felt like torture wrapped in red tape. And Aaron went home with Ben that evening, feeling numb, her eyes tired, her arms heavy. And when she opened the door, she found Toby right where she left him. But something was wrong. He didn't lift his head, didn't wag his tail, just looked at her, with eyes so tired it broke something in her chest. And she rushed to him, Ben still in her arms, whispering, "Toby, Toby, we're back, it's okay." But his breathing was shallow, his body limp, and she knew it was time. And she called the vet, her voice steady only because it had to be. And as they drove in the dark, snow falling in sheets around them, Aaron reached across the console to rest her hand on Toby's head, whispering, "You did it. You saved us. You can rest now." And when they reached the clinic, the vet met them with gentle eyes and quiet movements. And Aaron sat on the floor of the sterile room, Ben curled in her lap, Toby's head in her other hand, as the injection was given. And she whispered to him until the last breath left his body, until the weight in his chest stilled, until the silence became unbearable. And then she wept, and so did the vet, and even little Ben made a sound, a quiet, sad whimper that felt like grief passed through generations. And the drive home was the longest of Aaron's life, the seat beside her too empty, the leash in her pocket a cruel reminder of what love can cost. And when they got home, Ben cried until he fell asleep, and Aaron stood at the door, looking at the space under the tree where Toby used to lie. And, for a moment, she thought she saw him, just a flicker, just a shadow, and she whispered, "Thank you," and turned off the lights. And in the days that followed, grief settled into the corners of their home, not loud or cruel, but soft and lingering, a presence that reminded them that something beautiful had been lost, but also that something beautiful had been left behind. And Aaron kept moving, one day at a time, raising Ben with the kind of fierce love Toby had shown her, telling him stories of a brave dog who once carried him through the cold to safety, who had watched over him like a guardian, who had taught his mother how to hope again. And, sometimes, when the wind howled against the windows, Aaron swore she could hear the soft pad of paws on the hallway floor, a reminder that love like that never really leaves, it just changes form. And somewhere deep in the folds of memory and faith, She believed Toby was still watching, still protecting, still loving them as fiercely as ever, even if they couldn't see him anymore. Spring didn't arrive all at once. It came in cautious trickles, like the world was scared to hope too quickly. But little by little, the frost that had once clung to rooftops melted into rivers along sidewalks, and the trees around Aaron's house began to bud again, shy green shoots stretching toward a sun that lingered longer each day. And inside the small house on Rosemont Avenue, life moved differently, slower, as though Toby's absence had changed the rhythm of everything, like a missing beat in a song that used to play on repeat. Aaron still paused sometimes at the back door, expecting to hear the scratch of paws, or felt her hand reach for the leash she no longer kept by the entryway. And Ben, now just over 1-year-old, would crawl to the blanket Toby used to sleep on, sitting there quietly like he was waiting for something or someone, and Aaron, watching him, would feel the ache swell up in her throat until she had to look away because it was easier to keep moving than to sit in grief too long, easier to focus on bottles and baby giggles and the sharp new pain in her knees from all the crawling and lifting and midnight walking. And so she threw herself into the days, into learning how to juggle her hospital shifts with motherhood, into keeping her promises to Toby, that she would raise this boy with everything she had, that she wouldn't let the world dim his light, that she'd never let him feel abandoned again. But those promises were tested when the second court hearing was scheduled, and this time, it wasn't about Lena, the birth mother who had, after their first meeting, quietly signed away her parental rights and disappeared from the process altogether. It was about the state, about whether Aaron could be considered a stable guardian, a permanent placement, a single woman with no partner, no extended family, working full-time and grieving a dog that had meant more to her than most humans ever had. And though the social workers never said it directly, Aaron could feel the judgment in their eyes, the unasked questions, the assumptions painted in polite phrases and checklists. So she did what she always did. She fought with honesty, with compassion, with proof, building a case from the bones of her truth, showing them the photo albums she'd started for Ben, the pediatrician reports with Healthy, weight gain, the childcare backup plan she'd arranged with 2 co-workers from the hospital, the savings account she'd opened in Ben's name, even the vet records for Toby, because somehow it all felt connected, every detail, every effort. And when the court day came, she stood before the judge with Ben on her hip and didn't cry, didn't beg, just told them the story from the beginning, about a dog who carried a baby in his teeth through the cold, about a woman who had nothing but a heartbeat of love left to give, and how that heartbeat had grown into something louder than any fear. And the judge listened quietly, taking notes, asking few questions. And when the ruling finally came, weeks later in a plain envelope, Aaron opened it at the kitchen table with her hands shaking. And when she read the words, "legal guardianship granted," she sobbed so hard she nearly collapsed, Ben in his high chair watching her with wide eyes. And for the first time in what felt like forever, the tears were from joy, from relief, from the weight finally lifting. And that night, she lit a candle beside Toby's collar on the bookshelf and whispered, "We did it, buddy." Because it never stopped being we, not really. Not when everything good that followed had started with his impossible act of love. Ben began walking soon after, wobbly-legged and fearless. And Aaron would laugh through her tears watching him chase after shadows or run giggling through the living room toward the front door. And sometimes when the wind came through just right, he'd pause and point to nothing, his little lips forming sounds that made no sense to anyone but him. But Aaron always answered, "I see him too, baby," even if she didn't. Because maybe Ben saw more than she did. Maybe children could sense the echoes we adults were too hardened to believe in, and in the quiet of the early mornings, with the coffee pot percolating and cartoons mumbling on low volume, Aaron began to write everything down, every detail of Toby's story, Ben's survival, her own resurrection from the lonely dark she used to live in, until the pages filled a battered leather journal that she hid in her closet, not ready to share it with the world yet, but needing to preserve it, because some stories demand to be remembered, even if no one else ever reads them. Meanwhile, at Mercer General Hospital, Life carried on, her co-workers treating her a little differently now, with more respect, more curiosity, some even calling her the girl with the miracle dog, and she'd smile politely but never said much, because explaining it felt like trying to explain why you still reach for someone who's been gone, or why a child's giggle at dusk can make you cry without knowing why. Ben started daycare part-time, and Aaron returned to full shifts, often, coming home exhausted but fulfilled, her arms aching from lifting patients and holding her growing son, and sometimes she'd pull into the driveway and sit in the car a moment longer than needed, staring at the porch Toby used to nap on, letting memory wrap around her before stepping back into the chaos of motherhood. And as the months passed, life settled into a new kind of normal, not perfect, not painless, but real, grounded, full of small victories. Ben's first real word, ba-ba, which Aaron swore was his way of saying Toby. His first fall, his first fever, each milestone marked with fierce love and whispered prayers, and Aaron carried on, determined to raise him into the kind of person who knew what courage looked like, who understood that sometimes heroes have fur and bad breath and give everything, without asking for anything in return. On the 1-year anniversary of Toby's death, she took Ben to the park where she and Toby used to walk in the early mornings, and together they released a balloon into the sky, Ben clapping as it floated, higher, Aaron crying silently beside him, her heart both breaking and healing at once, and for a moment, she felt something warm on the breeze, a presence maybe, or just the comfort of remembering. But whatever it was enough, and life moved on, as it always does, but differently, now, coloured by love, loss, and the legacy of a dog no one had wanted until he became everything. Summer crept in with that heavy kind of heat that makes everything feel slower, like even time itself was sweating through its clothes, and the small house on Rosemont Avenue, though shaded by old trees and cooled by clunky window units, still seemed to hum with a warmth that wasn't just about temperature. It was about growth, about something alive blooming inside those walls. Because Ben, now 18 months old and running like a rocket, had become the centre of a world that never quite stopped spinning. And Aaron, who still kept a drawer full of Toby's old toys she couldn't bring herself to throw away, found herself wondering more and more about what kind of man her boy would grow into, what kind of mark he'd leave behind one day, and whether Toby somehow knew in that moment he chose to carry that plastic bag in his teeth, that he was saving more than just a baby, that he was saving a future, a family, a story that refused to be ordinary. The heat brought more than just long days and sunscreen-slicked cheeks. It brought questions too, because Ben had started pointing to the photos of Toby that Aaron kept on the bookshelf, saying, "Bobo," with wide, proud eyes. And Aaron would smile and say, "That's right, baby, that's Toby, your hero," even though he couldn't possibly remember the dog who had saved him. And yet, sometimes he acted like he did. Like when he would curl up on that old fleece blanket Toby used to sleep on, or toddle over to the spot by the screen door where Toby once stood watch every night, and she'd feel it, deep and strange, like maybe some memories don't need words to last. And as the days turned into weeks, and Ben started mimicking her every move, trying to brush his own hair, dragging a spoon across the table like he was feeding an invisible friend, Aaron felt more than ever the weight of being both mother and father, protector and provider, all while still grieving a dog who had taught her how to be brave in the first place. And it wasn't easy, not with double shifts and hospital chaos and groceries she never had time to buy, but she made it work, one scraped knee, one bedtime story, one whispered prayer at a time, and sometimes, when Ben fell asleep with his little hand wrapped around her finger, she'd cry into the quiet, not from sadness exactly, but from something harder to name, something like gratitude mixed with longing, like hope shaped from loss. And it was during one of those quiet nights, curled up on the couch with a warm mug and the baby monitor humming soft static, that Aaron first opened her laptop and began typing, really typing, more than just journal, scribbles, more than notes or scattered lines. She began writing the story of how Toby found Ben, how the hospital staff panicked when a stray dog burst through the doors with a garbage bag in his teeth, how one nurse knelt down instead of pushing him away, and how that moment split time in two creating a before and an after. And once she started, she couldn't stop. The words poured out of her, raw and fast and sometimes misspelled, sometimes punctuated with tears, but always honest. And by the time the sun rose the next morning, she'd written 20 pages without realizing it. 20 pages of pain and beauty and unthinkable love. And for the first time in months, she felt something stir inside her. A purpose beyond survival. A calling, maybe. Like the story itself was demanding to be told. Not for her, not even for Toby, but for every kid who ever felt discarded. For every woman trying to do it alone. For every dog whose loyalty went unnoticed. She kept writing late at night, after Ben was down and the dishes were done, building the story piece by piece, like a shelter made from memory. And one day, on a whim, she emailed the first few chapters to a former college friend who now worked in publishing, not expecting a reply, just needing to let it go into the world. And days later, her phone buzzed during a shift break, and the message simply said, "This is incredible. Can we talk?" And suddenly, impossibly, the story of Toby and Ben and that night at Mercer General wasn't just hers anymore. It was going to be a book, a real one, with pages and chapters, and a chance to reach hearts far beyond her small circle, and that terrified her, because it meant sharing the most sacred, painful parts of her life with strangers. But it also felt right, like the natural continuation of everything Toby had set in motion. And so she said yes. And just like that, the quiet life she'd carefully stitched together began to stretch in new directions, not tearing, but growing, expanding with possibility. And even as she worked through edits and emails and interviews, she never let it take away from Ben. He was still her beginning and end, the reason behind every sentence, every breath. And as he began learning more words, more emotions, Aaron found herself telling him about Toby, not just the facts, but the heart of it. How he was brave and scruffy and too stubborn to let go. How he didn't wait to be asked, he just acted. And how sometimes the right thing feels scary, but you do it anyway. And Ben listened, his little face full of wonder, and she could swear that something in him understood, deeply, almost like the bond between them had passed through Toby like a bridge. And just when Aaron thought she'd found a new rhythm, life threw her another curveball. A local news station reached out after hearing about the book in progress, wanting to do a segment on the miracle dog who saved a baby. And at first she said no, terrified of turning something sacred into something shallow. But then she thought of all the people who might need the hope in that story, and she agreed. And the day they came to film, she dressed Ben in his little overalls and sat beside him on the porch, answering questions about Toby with tears in her eyes and laughter in her throat. And when they aired the piece the next week, something unexpected happened. The community responded, not with pity, but with love. Letters poured in, people sending, toys for Ben, framed paintings of Toby, even offers from local rescues to adopt if she ever wanted another dog. And though she wasn't ready yet, not for another paw print on the floor or a leash by the door, it warmed her heart to know that Toby's life had rippled outward, touching strangers he'd never met, proving again that courage never dies, it just multiplies. And one night, after tucking Ben into bed, she stood in the doorway and whispered, "You were never just a dog, were you?" Because by then she knew Toby had been the hand of fate, the whisper in the dark, the answer to a prayer she hadn't even known how to ask. And his story was far from over because it now lived in her son, in every footstep he took, in every time he stumbled and got back up again. And though Aaron still missed him with an ache so sharp it sometimes stole her breath, she also knew he was still here, in the laughter, in the healing, in the future. They were building one small miracle at a time. By the time Ben turned 3, the seasons seemed to move faster, like time had picked up a pace that no one could quite keep up with. And Aaron often found herself staring at her son's growing feet, his longer limbs, the way his laughter had shifted from a baby's bubbling giggle to a little boy's full-throated joy, and every milestone, his first full sentence, the first time he counted to 20 without help, the first time he called out, "Mommy, I did it!" hit her like a wave, beautiful and brutal, because she couldn't stop thinking about how none of it would have happened if a ragged stray hadn't defied every odd and carried that garbage bag to Mercer General that morning. Some days, she still woke up in a panic, dreaming she was back in that hospital break room, watching Toby lay the bag down at her feet, only to open it and find it empty or worse. And those dreams haunted her in a strange way, not because she feared them, but because they reminded her how fragile it all had been, how easily she could have looked away, how the world so often demanded that people not care too much, not get involved, not feel. But Aaron had felt deeply, and that decision had changed everything. So now, every time Ben shouted for her or ran into her arms after daycare, she felt both gratitude and guilt, like she owed something more to the memory of that dog who gave her this life. And so she kept writing, expanding the story, pouring the smallest details of Toby's journey onto the page. The exact sound his paws made on the hospital tile, the way his ears flicked when he heard her voice, the impossible moment when he let her touch him for the first time. And each word carved deeper into her chest, but it also healed her in unexpected ways. The book was now in its final stages with a real cover, a release date, even pre-orders rolling in, and the publisher was pushing for a national launch, interviews, appearances, the whole thing, and it terrified her because she wasn't built for spotlights. She was just a nurse who got lucky, a tired mum still figuring things out. But every time she doubted herself, she thought about how Toby had acted without certainty, without permission, and that was enough to push her forward. She agreed to a local book reading at the library, the same one where she'd once borrowed dog training manuals when she first brought Toby home. And on the day of the event, the parking lot was full, people spilling into the aisles, holding copies of the manuscript's early chapters printed off the internet, some with tears in their eyes before she even said a word. And Aaron stood behind the podium with Ben clinging shyly to her leg, reading the opening lines aloud with a voice that only trembled once but held strong all the way through. And when she finished, there was silence, and then applause. Not polite, not casual, but loud and real, the kind that fills a space like love. And for the first time since Toby died, Aaron felt something like peace, like maybe this was what she was meant to do all along. Tell the truth, tell the story, keep the light alive. After the reading, a woman approached her holding a small girl in a wheelchair and said through tears, "Your dog saved my hope." And Aaron didn't know how to respond except to kneel down and hug the child, letting the moment say more than words could. And from that day forward, everything changed. The book became a quiet sensation, passed around in churches, schools, shelters, even hospitals, especially hospitals, where nurses whispered about it during break shifts and left copies in waiting rooms, where mums clutched it during long nights beside NICU incubators. And one by one, stories started finding their way back to Aaron. Babies abandoned and found, stray dogs adopted, lonely kids choosing kindness because of something they read in her pages. And each one felt like a thread in a bigger tapestry, woven by Toby's one impossible choice. And yet, in the quiet moments, Aaron still struggled, because grief isn't clean or linear, and some nights she sat on the porch with a glass of wine, staring into the dark, whispering, "I miss you, boy," hoping somehow Toby could hear her, wherever dogs like him go when they're gone. Ben, now more curious and talkative than ever, had started asking big questions. Why did Toby save me? Was he scared? Was I loud in the bag? Did he know you were nice? And Aaron always answered the best she could, sometimes laughing, through tears, other times just pulling him into her arms and saying, "Because love finds a way, sweetheart, even when nobody's looking for it." And that became their bedtime mantra, something Ben would say before sleep. Love finds a way. And she'd kiss his head and think, yes, it does, and it did. One evening, just before a thunderstorm, Aaron and Ben were digging through old boxes in the attic, looking for fall decorations, when they came across an old shoebox labelled Toby. Inside were his collar, his favorite squeaky toy, a worn-out photo of him resting beside baby Ben in the hospital, and a letter she had forgotten she wrote, scrawled with shaking hands the night Toby died, saying thank you for everything, for saving them, for being more than anyone expected. And Aaron sat down hard, holding the collar to her chest as tears came fast, unexpected, but not unwelcome. And Ben, now old enough to understand the weight of a moment, crawled into her lap and whispered, "He's still here, right?" And Aaron nodded, pressing her face into his curls, saying, "Always." And that night, as the storm cracked across the sky and wind howled through the trees, they sat together on the living room rug with Toby's things laid out between them. And Aaron told Ben every story she could remember. How Toby used to bark at the mailman but never at kids. How he once tried to rescue a raccoon cub and ended up with a scratched nose. How he'd curl up beside the crib and whine softly until Ben stopped crying. And long after Ben fell asleep, curled up like a puppy himself, Aaron sat alone, staring out the window, whispering promises into the dark. That she'd keep telling their story. That she wouldn't let the world forget. That she'd live the kind of life Toby had believed she was worthy of. And in the weeks that followed, that promise led her to new places. Interviews on daytime shows, an invitation to speak at an animal welfare gala, and even a call from a small indie filmmaker who wanted to adapt the story into a short film. And though it all felt surreal, she said yes, again and again, choosing to be brave in Toby's name. And every time she stepped on stage or in front of a camera, she remembered that morning in the hospital, the smell of coffee, the sharp buzz of the intercom, the sight of a stray dog carrying a bag no one wanted to see, and how everything beautiful in her life came from not looking away. And maybe that was the lesson, the legacy, the whole point, to choose love even when it's inconvenient, even when it's messy and hard and terrifying, because that's what Toby did. And that's what turned a broken morning into a miracle. And as Aaron tucked Ben into bed one night, he asked sleepily, "Can we get a dog someday?" And Aaron smiled through the ache in her chest, brushing hair from his eyes, and said, "Someday, yes, but only if we find the right one." And Ben nodded solemnly, then whispered, "Maybe a dog like Toby." And Aaron kissed his forehead and said, "There's no one like Toby, baby, but if one comes close, we'll know." By the time Ben was 6, the world had shifted again, in ways both small and massive, like the universe kept pushing forward whether you were ready or not. And Aaron had come to understand that being a parent meant constantly letting go of pieces you wanted to hold on to forever. His baby shoes boxed up, his once chubby hands now leaner, his voice trading softness for curiosity as he asked a million questions about everything from clouds to God, to why people were sometimes mean to animals. And through it all, one truth remained like gravity. Toby was still there, not in fur or bark or breath, but in presence, woven into their lives like thread in a favorite sweater. And even though years had passed since he lay curled at the foot of Ben's crib, Aaron still found herself hesitating at the doorway to that old corner in the living room, half expecting to see him lift his head or wag his tail. And the book, now translated into 6 languages and made into a short film that had gone viral on streaming platforms, brought strangers to their doorstep, with stories and flowers and letters that began with "Your dog saved me," which never stopped stunning Aaron, not because she didn't believe in Toby, but because she never imagined that one act, one morning, one stray dog's courage could ripple outward this far, reaching people in cities she'd never visit, lives she'd never know, all because he chose to care when no one else did. And the world, for all its cruelty, had also begun to care. Laws changed quietly. Hospitals updated protocols for accepting animals in emergencies. Shelters reported spikes in adoptions after people read her story. And a non-profit was started, in Toby's name, Toby's Bridge, to fund rescues, neonatal care, and grief support for families like hers, who understood that love, especially the kind offered without condition, deserved to be honoured. But even as the world kept spinning forward, at home, Aaron's world remained beautifully simple. She worked less now, picking up shifts only part-time, so she could walk Ben to school in the mornings, pack his lunches with hand-drawn napkin, notes, and read beside him each night from a growing stack of books about animals, heroes, and brave little boys who were found when they were almost lost. And though she was grateful for the calm, something inside her still burned with purpose, like unfinished business tugging at her chest every time she saw a child alone at a bus stop or a news story about abandonment or neglect. And one night, while going through a box of old interview recordings, Aaron heard her own voice say, "I think Toby knew more about love than most people ever will." And that sentence, raw, off the cuff, never meant for publication, lingered in her mind like a spark. So she started sketching ideas for a new book, not just about Toby's moment of rescue, but everything after, the healing, the grief, the way she still caught herself crying over the space he left behind, how Ben had inherited his courage, and how sometimes bravery was just choosing to wake up and care again. And this second book, which she titled The Quiet Pawprint, came from a deeper place, less about miracles and more about aftermaths, about what it meant to carry on when the miracle fades and the spotlight moves on. And as she wrote, Aaron noticed Ben watching her more closely, as if trying to understand the thing she carried around behind her eyes. And one evening, as they sat on the porch watching fireflies, he asked, "Mum, do you think Toby would like me now?" And the question almost shattered her, because it meant he still worried about being enough, about deserving the life he'd been given. And she pulled him into her arms, held him tight, and said, "Toby would love you, Ben, not just like you, because you're brave and kind, and you don't even know it." And Ben whispered, "I want to help people like he did," which made Aaron realize it was time to give him more than stories. It was time for a new chapter. So that weekend, they visited a local rescue shelter together, not to adopt, not yet, but to volunteer. And as Ben helped fill food bowls, read stories to nervous dogs, and sat patiently with an elderly lab who hadn't wagged its tail in days, Aaron saw something click in him, something strong and quiet and important. And the shelter director, a gentle woman named Martha, took her aside and said, "You've got a little healer on your hands." And Aaron smiled through the lump in her throat because yes, that's exactly what he was becoming. Over the following months, volunteering became their Saturday ritual. Ben would wake up early, put on his Team Toby shirt, and pack his backpack with peanut butter treats and books. And at the shelter, he started helping with intake, greeting, dogs with soft words and calm hands. And it was during one of these mornings that he met Riley, a gangly, scarred, half-deaf mutt with cloudy eyes and a broken tail who'd been found in a ditch, shaking and growling at everything. And no one thought he'd be adoptable. But Ben, with the patience only children and angels possess, sat outside Riley's kennel for days, reading aloud, leaving snacks, whispering, "It's okay, I see, you." Until one day Riley scooted forward, sniffed his hand, and rested his head on Ben's knee. And Martha burst into tears because she'd never seen the dog trust anyone. And Aaron, watching from a distance, knew right then that the torch had passed, that this was the moment when Ben became more than a rescued boy. He became the rescuer. And Riley was his first save, his own version of Toby. Not a replacement, never that, but a new beginning, a way forward. And yes, eventually they brought Riley home, after long conversations about commitment and safety and love. And when Riley curled up at the foot of Ben's bed that first night, Aaron felt Toby's spirit so strongly, she almost whispered aloud, "Thank you for sending him." And she slept soundly for the first time in months. Life, as it does, continued to weave joy and sorrow together. Aaron's father passed away that winter, quietly, after a short illness. And at the funeral, Ben clutched Riley's leash and said, "It's okay, Grandpa's with Toby now." And somehow that helped more than any sermon, and Aaron leaned into her son's wisdom, into his growing ability to carry pain without becoming bitter, just like Toby had. And when spring returned, she finished The Quiet Pawprint, sending it to her publisher with a note that said, "This one is for the days after, the days no one tells you how to live. And when the book launched, it didn't explode like the first, but it did something quieter, more enduring. Grief counselors recommended it. Veterans shared it in support groups. It became a staple at therapy centers and pediatric clinics, and Aaron found herself invited to speak not just about dogs, but about endurance, healing, and choosing hope again and again, especially when it's hard. And one evening after a school event where Ben had stood up to read a short essay titled, "The Dog Who Saved Me," twice Aaron walked past his bedroom and heard him talking to Riley saying, "You're safe now. You're mine, and I'll always come back for you." And it took everything in her not to cry, because somehow her little boy had grown into a protector, a lighthouse, the kind of person the world needs more of. And maybe, just maybe, that meant she'd done something right. And in the stillness of the night, Aaron would sometimes sit on the porch alone, Riley sleeping at her feet, and look up at the stars, whispering her thanks to the dog who had started it all, to the quiet miracle wrapped in fur and dirt and stubborn loyalty. And she knew in her bones that the story wasn't over, not really, because love like that never ends. It just changes form, keeps showing up, one rescue at a time. Years later, in a town that had slowly changed its shape, but never its soul, on a street where dogwood trees bloomed every spring and children still raced each other after school with scuffed sneakers and wild laughter, Ben stood tall outside, the community center he had helped renovate, its wooden sign freshly painted with the words, "The Toby Center for Hope and Healing." And as the ribbon fluttered in the breeze waiting to be cut, he could hardly believe this was real, that the boy once found in a trash bag on a cold morning by a dog with nothing but instinct and heart had grown into the young man holding the ceremonial scissors, surrounded by people who had believed in him, including his mother, Aaron, now grey at the temples but still strong, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder, just like she used to when he was 5 and afraid of the dark. And as the mayor introduced him with a speech full of warmth and reverence, Ben's eyes scanned the crowd until he found familiar faces, Martha from the shelter, now retired but still bringing treats to the dogs every week, Mrs. Dalton from the hospital, who had been there the morning the dog ran through the hallway, with something far more precious than garbage in his mouth, and even Mr. Thomas, the gruff neighbour who once grumbled about barking dogs, but now served as the centre's maintenance man because, as he put it, "If that mutt could save a life, I can damn well fix a door." And when Ben stepped up to speak, his voice steady but full of emotion, he didn't read from the note cards he'd prepared. Instead, he looked at everyone and said, "I don't remember the first hours of my life, but I've spent every moment since then trying to live a life worthy of that second chance." And silence fell over the crowd like a blanket, thick with meaning, until a sniffle cracked it. Then applause rose up like a wave, crashing into cheers and tears alike. And after the ribbon fell, the building came alive. Kids poured into the reading room, where therapy dogs waited patiently beside Bean, bags and shelves of picture books. Veterans wandered into the quiet spaces built just for them, places to talk or simply sit with a dog who wouldn't ask questions but always understood. And in the back corner, Aaron sat beside a young mother holding a baby wrapped in a soft blue blanket, telling her, "You're not alone, and you never will be." And later that evening, after the crowd had gone and the centre had exhaled its first day into dusk, Ben walked the empty hallways, Riley trailing behind him, now slower, older, his face white with age, but his tail still wagging when their eyes met. And in one of the smaller rooms, a meditation space lined with candles and a single framed photograph of Toby, Ben knelt down, placed a hand on Riley's back, and whispered, "We did it, buddy. We really did it." Then looked up at Toby's picture, that same old grainy shot of him standing in front of Mercer General with a garbage bag in his mouth, and smiled. Because the story had never just been about the rescue, it had always been about what came after, the ripples spreading from that impossible morning when a stray dog with no reason to believe in people chose to believe anyway. And even now, so many years on, the details of that day lived in sharp colour inside Aaron's memory. The blur of Toby's fur streaking past her coffee cup, the weight of the bag on the tile floor, the baby's cold skin against her trembling fingers, and the way Toby leaned into her hand when she scratched behind his ears, like he had been waiting all his life for someone to touch him without fear, And she had kept every letter, every news article, every crayon drawing a child had sent with Toby's name scrawled in shaky handwriting, all stored in an old cedar chest that smelled faintly of vanilla and dust. And sometimes when the weight of the world felt too much, she would open it, read a few, cry softly, and remember that love, even when born from pain, could bloom into something unbreakable. Riley passed in his sleep that fall, curled up beside Ben's bed the same way Toby once had. And though it broke something inside of them again, they buried him beneath the dogwood tree with his favorite toy and a plaque that read, "Faithful, friend, gentle heart, the bridge between two boys." And for days afterward, the house felt hollow, like the silence had teeth. But in time, as it always had, life filled the space with laughter, new routines, and eventually, inevitably, a puppy named Daisy, clumsy and full of chaos, who tore through the kitchen like a furry hurricane and slept with her head on Ben's shoe every night. And Ben, now working full-time at the center and studying part-time to become a counselor for trauma-affected youth, often told Daisy stories of the ones who came before her, the heroes in fur who taught him how to love. And Aaron, older now, slower in her walk, but still sharp in spirit, started writing again. Not books this time, but letters to new mothers who showed up at the center afraid and lost. Letters that began with, "I know how scared you are, but you are stronger than you think," because she knew the power of being seen, of someone reaching into the dark and pulling you toward the light. And on the 10th anniversary of the rescue, a bronze statue was unveiled in front of Mercer General Hospital. Toby, mid-stride, garbage bag in his mouth, eyes focused forward, and beneath it, a plaque that read, "In memory of the hero who saw value in what the world had thrown away." And Aaron stood beside Ben, hand in hand, tears on her cheeks, not of grief, but of awe, because how else do you describe a life that began with abandonment and ended with legacy? And in that moment, they knew something with absolute certainty. Toby hadn't just saved one baby, he had saved generations, because everyone who walked through the doors of the Toby Center would carry forward the lesson of one stray dog's impossible choice, that love, when offered freely, has the power to change everything.